So thank you very much, Mark, for making the time. The purpose of this session is for us to discuss and provide an update and have a little bit of more detailed discussion around the agenda that the ITW Global Leaders Forum, the GLF, is driving, and understand a little bit more around the motivations, why it exists, and what is it actually trying to achieve. So, Mark, just maybe wanted to kick this off. There's also a...
I just have to do cleanup. I have to pay my salary, okay?
Sure.
So PCCW Global is the international operating arm of HKT, which is based in Hong Kong. We have a global network worldwide. And I'm also on the board of directors of the Bridge Alliance, representing CSL, which is our domestic mobile arm in Hong Kong. Okay, end of commercial.
Absolutely, absolutely fair enough. There is also a Slido being used for this session as well. So one of the challenges Mark gave me ahead of this is like, please ask challenging questions. So if you think I'm failing, please do, and put through your own questions as well. And hopefully we will have a meaningful discussion and good answers from those. But maybe just to kind of like go very much to the start of the things and the origin. So you've been involved obviously since the inception of GLF around 3 years ago. Could you maybe give a little bit of a background of why the GLF was founded, and what were the reasons behind it, and also the timing, like why now?
I think the GLF started as sort of an evolution of carriers. First of all, there were a group of senior executives from major service providers that helped, together with Capacity Media, to form what became known as International Telecoms Week, ITW, which replaced the old GTM, the Global Traffic Meeting, which once upon a time sort of drove capacity over satellite. That was the historical evolution. I think ITW is probably about 14, 15 years old, if I'm not mistaken, something in that neighborhood. And those senior executives who were involved in the founding of the ITW, of the International Telecoms Week, eventually, with the support and backing of Capacity Media, actually created a forum of senior commercial decision makers from the companies that a subset of them were in this slide that you've put up on the screen, that felt that it was necessary to, in addition to having a conference where everyone gathered to meet to discuss traffic requirements and so on, would also deal with issues of importance to the industry and determine whether or not there could be some approach, not violating any antitrust rules, but some sort of approach that would help drive the framework of wholesale industry behavior in a way that would be further collaborative, a little bit more dynamic, facilitate work around new services and new products, and perhaps deal with the challenges of the day.
So I know that you're also involved in the board of PTC, the Pacific Telecommunications Council. I know PCCW Global also have a board seat in MEF. There's also GSMA, there's TM Forum, there's a number of I3 Forum and so forth. Why do we, put it bluntly, why do we need another organization? Isn't this potentially driving further the kind of additional divisions and empire building and so forth? Why do we need another organization?
Well, each of these organizations that are out there are aspiring to do very, very good things. GSMA was involved initially in establishing standards for mobile operators, standards that were in part not being driven as quickly as necessary at that time by the mobile industry for the predecessor activity that was done by ITU. Other forms that have evolved, for instance, MEF, actually, its acronym originally stood for Metro Ethernet Forum, but it evolved beyond that. TM Forum was also setting up worlds associated with OSS and BSS. And there's other activities around technology, IETF, IEEE, all of these environments, ICPC, which deals with electricity and undersea cables, and so on and so on. There are many of these different industry forums, each of them doing very important things. Most often, these industry forums are focused today on the technical. And they've often shied away from determining what are the commercial frameworks for new technology evolution that facilitates new services. The GLF saw all of this and said, do we need another forum? And the answer is, you're probably right, maybe we don't, unless we can meet some sort of gap which exists in the market of forums and industry bodies that seek to organize how businesses evolve. And in a world of open source and so much change and so much confusion, having some sort of body that says, hey, let's look at the commercial issues. Let's determine how all of these different technologies and the way we interact and the way the business is moving, the way clouds are driving, the way regulators are pushing, the way service providers are interacting, the deltas between fixed, mobile, enterprise requirements and so on. How do we take a look from a senior commercial decision-making point of view at what is the best possible commercial behavior? So that was the anchor. And then we said, look, if we try and set up a forum that competes with all these, it would be nonsensical. And perhaps a model would necessarily be to look at all of the work that all of these other forums are doing and to act as a senior endorsement body, to say, MEF, you've done a very good job in setting up LSO architecture, lifecycle orchestration of data services. GSMA, you've done excellent work associated with IoT spec. ITU, you're focused now on thought processes around V4 and V6 that are important to different countries and so on. Can we look at all of these different elements and present them in some structured way through the senior commercial decision-making body, and then say, yes, we've had a look at this as a group of industry executives that try to govern sensible commercial thought processes at the wholesale level in and amongst service providers, and we'd like to then act as an endorsement body. So that was the initial structure. But I admit that we've since moved on to actually try and take a leadership position in thought processes driven from a commercial anchor in some additional areas, some other areas.
And what would be the motivation for the incentive for these other bodies to engage in that work that at the GLF we're trying to do?
Well, some of these bodies are doing tremendous work. First of all, sometimes they have many colleagues employed in the organization, such as ITU or GSMA, but sometimes, unfortunately perhaps, because there's so much information hitting us, so much innovation that's coming from so many different angles. Sometimes it's a matter of prioritization and saying, wait, which innovation, which area of activity, whether it be technology or commercial or product or this or that, is going to be meaningful first at the retail level? To what extent can that meaningful innovation then be aggregated backwards to the wholesale environment, and particularly in the international, cross-border, cross-functional wholesale environment? And sometimes the work that really good colleagues are doing inside these organizations, therefore, get missed, let's be honest. Because organizations are large, everyone competes for senior executive attention. How do you say to the CEO of a company, hey, you should really look at this new standard that was developed by the i3 Forum associated with A2P messaging? Why is that a prioritization for someone to look at? But if an industry body can embrace the work that's been done by i3 Forum, for instance, to combat fraud, or to facilitate A2P messaging, or to do something of that nature, then it becomes meaningful because this body of senior executives have all taken a step together, endorsed the work that was done by very good colleagues in MEF, in i3 Forum, in GSMA, in ITU, in TM Forum, in IETF, wherever these organizations be, and say, hey, this technical work that was done is really meaningful from a commercial point of view, and this is why. And this is what this body of executives collectively decided to endorse together to say, well done, team, and this is the way we're going to be leveraging your work for the benefit of the industry as a whole.
And what's then the process around the modus operandi? Because it's a huge amount of work. How can GLF come to the conclusions that
well,
this is
let's be honest, Jussi, you tell me what to do, and I tell everybody what you told me to do. I think that's really the way it works, right? No, I'm kidding. What we've done is we've created a very sensible approach. First of all, thank you to Capacity Media for initially facilitating the management role of the GLF Director's Office, which you fulfill, you and your team. That was a fantastic first step, which allowed Capacity to seed the work that was done ultimately by the GLF. But then the GLF took a very important decision, and I think we should say it outright, to say Capacity Media is one thing, the body of the GLF is separate. And the GLF takes decisions through a membership and governance committee together with articles of association associated with it, with a fee which is paid into the GLF for GLF distribution and utilization only. It's not meant in any way to be a messaging platform for capacity media. And for that, I applaud Capacity, first for recognizing the importance, seeding the opportunity, but then also stepping back from the influencer and rather just being the facilitator. And that takes guts for a media organization that's trying to be seriously involved with the industry. And so that was very valuable. Once we set up that membership and governance ordinance and structure, we invited carriers to join based upon the membership and governance criteria. And it's open, really, still, for anyone who meets the criteria to simply submit an email to myself or the Membership and Governance Committee, which can then be reviewed against the Articles of Association, and we're happy to bring members on. Thankfully, we've had no member leave since we've started, and we've only had aspiration of more service providers to join. And I think that that's an indication that what we've done is positive, and therefore the interest in joining the GLF and getting access to the decision-making, to the thought processes, is therefore aspirational within the carrier community. The methodology, as we said first, let's do the mission statements, that the GLF act as an endorsement body for other activities, also that it serve as a voice of the industry around areas of wholesale interoperability. And I think that the only specific area of criteria is to assure that service providers that are involved in GLF would be willing to accept the concept that wholesale interoperability at face level is important. And then the tools of our work are working groups associated with topics of interest that the GLF members vote upon or propose and then vote upon after listening to the dialogue, and whether it is meaningful to the industry as a whole and not just to one specific carrier or another. And I think that that has been the strength of the GLF so far. Number one, inclusiveness. Number two, the willingness to take a step back and look at all the other industry forums and applaud the work that they're doing. And three, to assure that no carrier or another is out pitching their wares as better than somebody else, but rather taking a step back and saying, this is going to be valuable for the industry as a whole. And once you have that as the basis, you can get to the method associated with the different subjects that we've dealt with.
Can I just on that note, and you mentioned the inclusiveness, if I may be a bit challenging, at the same time all the membership effectively carriers. So, a skeptical could argue that is the purpose is to protect the status quo of the carrier business model, or what's your response in?
Well, I hope we're not protecting a status quo, because a status quo would argue that we're focused on legacy, trying to keep things as they are, and one might argue that that would take us downhill, and the only argument would be at what pace would we be going downhill. And so I don't think that we're eager to maintain any status quo. On the contrary, the GLF is working hard to identify the new areas that should be facilitating this industry. One area of focus is to collectively combat fraud. Another is to collectively work to assure that platforms are secure. A third is to focus on new areas of settlement. One of the use cases being bandwidth on demand, where we're working closely with MEF as an example in that space. On anti-fraud, we work closely with i3 Forum. On security, we're working with IETF and NANOG in order to make sure that those activities are done wisely. And I think lastly, what we're focused on now, three areas of excitement from my point of view that I think can be meaningful to the industry. First is blockchain, which I heard badmouthed a couple panels ago, and we can talk about that. A second is which I think can be quite critical for the manner of settlement and automations. A second area is where we're headed as an industry in IoT, and let it be known that IoT is certainly not a mobile-only story. It's also fixed, it's also cloud. And third, I think where we're headed next to focus upon is probably what will be the impact of the new world of edge cloud that will be driven perhaps by 5G and other areas. So the blockchain, the IoT, and edge cloud, three forward areas: security, anti-fraud, and some regulatory areas that we focused upon. All of these have been quite important to the industry, and we seem to have found a common road around that. So I don't think that we're focused on maintaining a status quo, nor do I think that we want this group of carriers to be the sole source of information. We would be eager to have clouds join this environment if the concept of interoperability can be accepted. I think that we're not far away from that if we, as a carrier community, can give the clouds what they want. Notice that I'm saying that we need to reach out to the clouds more intelligently as a carrier community. And I think that we're not too far away from seeing that type of evolution. And I think it's important that you note that in this framework here, there are mobile operators, there are fixed network operators, and so there are different areas of functional interest presented within the GLF, which adds a good amount of value as well.
Talking about that, maybe it's a good opportunity to dive a little bit deeper into the actual tangible actions that we're doing, and especially around the exciting areas you mentioned, blockchain, which admittedly everybody's talking about blockchain and very few know actually what they mean by that, and it's a sort of like even having a risk that it becomes a sort of overused word that everybody starts rolling their eyes when they hear blockchain. But from the carriers, from GLF perspective, what is the GLF actually doing in blockchain and why?
So from a carrier community point of view and the services that we've been providing on a wholesale basis or that we aim to provide on a wholesale basis, to be quite frank, there's been very little automation in our own back-end business in terms of interoperability, inter-carrier connectivity. Blockchain is a one-word buzzword which is meant to describe a series of code-capable environments, also now more commonly referred to more recently as distributed ledger technology, or DLT. And that distributed ledger technology, whether it's driven by Ethereum code or by Hyperledger, which is promoted by some companies and so on, regardless of which one or others that are out there, the most important aspects of distributed ledger or blockchain is to facilitate, number one, the writing into code of contracts. To take manual contracts, in these rooms over here, people are sitting in bilateral sessions and agreeing a set of relationships. And they put that into a contract, they go to the lawyer, then they go to the product manager, then they go to the operations people, and all of this stuff is quite manual processes. And yet what we're selling is technology. How can we, as an industry, focus consistently on manual processes, repackage ourselves into the back end without driving some thought around automation? First step, write the contracts into code. Then make sure that the contracts between you and code is understood correctly between two parties. And in a wholesale industry environment, if trust through the blockchain can be verified and therefore secure, you can then facilitate inter-industry automation. Automation, trust, security, removing the manual processes and turning the contracts into something smart will then facilitate more creativity. It will create grander dimensioning of the products and services that we've traditionally offered. If people are outside on the floor negotiating voice agreements, these are two-dimensional agreements. They're talking about a destination and the volume. If they're talking about capacity, again, mildly two-dimensional. Point A, point Z, and a duration associated with it. What if we can be far more flexible in an IoT environment and say, well, we want to have bandwidth on demand delivered with information access to multiple enterprises. We want a smart card to provide information to the insurer, which was an example we heard on the previous panel, but we also want the wife to know where the husband is, or the husband to know where the wife is for whatever reason. Maybe we don't. But those things move us forward to more information, more accessibility, but it also requires more creativity in how a product is developed, and then how are the back-end relationships in digital platform partnerships settled. And none of this has been worked out as an industry. There's very creative thought that's happening piecemeal as AI and as 5G and all of these things start to evolve at retail levels. But no consolidated industry work to say, here's a framework that will facilitate creativity and automation mutually amongst many service providers, many layers of access, fully secure. The blockchain or the distributed ledger technology, if we can get to a framework that is acceptable to the bulk of the industry, will be able to move those concepts forward, create efficiencies, and perhaps help colleagues that are working with us today in manual processes become ever more creative and focus their attentions on the front end of business development instead of trying to fit into back-end systems that were developed 10, 20, even 30 years ago.
So what do you see is the main challenges around these sort of activities? What's holding back on wider automation blockchain adoption?
2 carriers in a room, you'll have 6 or 7 opinions. So if you have 30 carriers in a room, you're going to have, well, whatever the square root of the number of carriers are in terms of those opinions. So corralling many of these opinions together to get to a common view, to get to a common framework, that in and of itself is the first challenge. I think I'm excited to tell you that yesterday, during the Global Leaders Forum session discussing distributed ledger technology or blockchain, I guess out of the 23 carriers that were in the room, roughly, more than half raised their hand immediately to say, we're interested to put down a small amount of funds in the tens of thousands of dollars, a small amount to demonstrate seriousness, to take part in an industry MOU, not too different from establishing perhaps a consortium undersea cable, in order to move forward with a common approach to managing technology that can be beneficial to all service providers and no proprietary work there. Interoperable, common standards that would be beneficial to all service providers. That was agreed. The other half in the room raised their hands saying they just want to go back to the people that helped them decide to make sure, but they're very eager to join. And so therefore, I believe that between now and the end of March, latest end of April, I think we will have the bulk of the GLF people that you see on the slide, is it up there? On the slide there, who will be raising their hands to join. And here's an important message to the other carriers in the room. This opportunity to join the MOU in terms of inclusiveness is not limited to GLF members. Any service provider, and that was agreed by the GLF yesterday as well, any service provider is welcome to join now into the framework. And I think that in of itself is exciting. That means the GLF is saying we don't want to control this, quite the contrary. We want to help set a framework that will facilitate the entire industry, and there may be winners and losers in that environment. But everyone understands that if we bury our head in the sand, we won't move forward. And so therefore, let's open it up, let's create the common framework. And a big round of applause to you, see, and to the team working with you for helping to facilitate that, because I think it was a landmark decision yesterday.
Well, thank you very much. And I think from my perspective, what the interesting, which we probably haven't seen in any other industry, you might disagree, is this a industry-wide approach? It's typically everywhere else we've seen various kind of initiatives, for instance, in shipping or insurance, which tended to be a very large player teaming up with a couple of others and then trying to bring up an industry solution, which then means that everybody else is suspicious. What we are trying to overcome and what we're trying to achieve is that the only thing that matters is the interoperability and the fact that no one wants to be tied into decisions made by anybody else. So let's try and work on a common solution that will facilitate that.
I think that's the key. If one of these service providers tried to push ahead and say, no, our solution is better than everyone else, it will create a competitive environment around the technology in and amongst the carrier community. And instead, what makes more sense is that the carrier community should band together and then be welcoming to adjacent industries, particularly cloud, or particularly service provider community that for whatever reason initially wouldn't join the initiative and then would be able to do that going forward with very little barriers to entry, if any. That would be the key. And what we've seen, at least in shipping, and a little bit also in air transport, is a move towards blockchain in this space, but not so much but logistics, is a move to blockchain in this space, but trying to have one entity being in control of the story on behalf of all the others. That's a recipe for suspicion. Let's be honest, we're working here through frameworks of voice IDDD and settlement that were arranged tens of years ago. That framework is fully agreed. Roaming, for instance, which is an addendum to the IS-41 technical agreement, interim standard technical agreement, is a standard that was written initially by 2 carriers, but was opened up to all carriers as a concept that should be used, and eventually became the template for interaction around roaming, initially of voice minutes, later of SMS traffic, and then later of gigabytes of traffic for data services. But those formats, again, represent 2-dimensional activity, and were enabled through manual behavior because the inability to aggregate systems among many different service providers. Here's an attempt to say, let's take those systems, without changing them, that exist with each provider, and now create some sort of automated framework that the industry generally agrees on, that will facilitate interoperability of automated settlement of multidimensional forms of transactions. That's all it says. So there doesn't need to be one entity or another in control. There needs to be a common framework agreement that will allow us to go to the complexity associated with IoT, the complexity associated with what the new interrelationships of edge cloud might yield in complicated regulated and deregulated environments. And these things, I think, are quite critical.
And just to clarify that as well, we are not just talking about voice as a use case. This is the whole industry settlement.
Yeah. Well, actually, when we first went to study it, we looked at bandwidth on demand because we wanted to look at that as a facilitator for new services. But the colleagues from the different companies who were involved in the use case tests said, look, let's do something tried and tested just to check. So we first did a dry month of CDRs between 2 carriers. Then we went to a multi-carrier environment with hundreds of millions of transactions, hundreds of millions of CDRs as a proof of concept. And the proof was in the pudding. You saw efficiencies, you saw activity. Now, it may not be in everyone's appetite to get involved in that space for voice, but the concept of blockchain will be interesting to those who want to do IoT, and it'll be interesting to those who want to be doing any form of bandwidth on demand. It'll be interesting to those who want to be dealing with new types of various services, spinning up virtual machines and charging them on demand against CPU usage with QoS-based IP and getting a discount on jitter because the video didn't come across so well in a 30-second span out of a 1-hour interview. How do you actually settle for all of these complicated issues as you go forward? And how do you assure that the carrier community becomes meaningful in this process instead of being also-rans to independent ecosystems that are driving themselves simply by writing code? And the answer is, first, that the carrier community create a common technology environment for code associated with wholesale settlement, nothing else. And then I think we may find that code-based players in the business, which are the X as a service applications, and they can be any one of the clouds, and I'm not just talking about the mega clouds, but anyone who's involved in software will say, hey, I can interface smartly with you as a digital platform settlement facilitator because you too understand what I do, which is to interface with code and not through manual processes. If we do that as an industry, we're facilitating digital transformation at the back end, which will then allow us to waterfall it down into our organizations and to have more creativity around the products we deliver.
So the message is very much so that this is open to everyone and this needs to be an industry. This is not the top 30, 40, this is the top 500.
The blockchain-based initiative or the distributed ledger technology initiative, which has been initiated by the Global Leaders Forum by decision of the GLF subcommittee, which included major carriers such as Telefonica, Orange, Telstra, BT, PCCW Global, Colt, China Telecom. All of these carriers agreed that we should not in any way keep things tucked under and do something just in a club. All of them agreed that it would be important to unveil this initiative to all service providers whenever they want to join. And they're welcome to contact you, not me, and to express their interest to join this initiative by signing the MOU that is being formulated right now and paying what we believe to be really a very small fee, which would be a seriousness fund, that if for some reason this thing doesn't work out, whatever money left over would be redistributed back.
So on that, this is we could probably talk about that for quite some time, but probably want to move on to other areas. But are there any questions in the audience or anything like that relation to this? There's obviously, I'm sure, further announcements.
Vanessa has a question.
Oh God, no. But there are actually 2 questions on Slido, so we're just going to pull it up for you now and leave it to you.
Sorry.
So what is the criterion for joining? Is it fee-based and budget? So 2 related questions.
Okay, let's differentiate first, because we talk about 2 things, right? So let's differentiate first the GLF, the Global Leaders Forum, the criterion for joining. Well, you better, there's a set of rules, right?
So yeah, absolutely. So joining the GLF, there is a eligibility criteria.
Okay, so let's not go through the list of what the eligibility criteria is. Is it fee? There is an eligibility criterion which the membership and governance, or the governance and membership committee review, and if you meet the criteria and you are willing to pay the fee, yes, it is fee-based, but in my view, not a large fee at all. Actually, compared to, let's say, if you were going to join the Linux Foundation or some other organization, really extremely low fee, and you pay in. By the way, that payment is initially made to Capacity Media, but it goes into a separate funding vehicle, which is audited by the Governance and Membership Committee. So that funding is unavailable to Capacity for any of its other utilization. It must only be dedicated and allocated to the GLF. When you see the value that comes back, I think that you'll discover, those of you who join, that it's an extremely worthwhile fee. The return on investment is significant. Where does the GLF get its budget from? From those fees. From those fees. And we
capacity
do use,
as well contributes.
Pardon?
And capacity as well contributes.
We'll see for how long. I don't know. But anyway, capacity contributes certainly, and they've helped seed the activity, which has been really appreciated and welcomed. And the actual work that is done, as we said, by your director's office, and is augmented also by a third-party consultant named Delta Partners. And actually some of that activity anchored out of their Dubai office here in the UAE, and that's why it's very meaningful to talk about it here. And I think that both UC and the team at Capacity, together with Delta Partners, deliver extreme value. The GLF meets formally at the senior level 3 times a year in front of Capacity Middle East, in front of ITW, and in front of Capacity Europe. And those are full-day meetings, quite full, that start 9 a.m. and go all the way through to the evening, with a packed agenda on many issues and initiatives. And separate to that, the subcommittees meet quite regularly, sometimes more than once or twice a month, depending upon how much activity and how much work is necessary to do. Is that fair?
Absolutely correct, absolutely. So moving on to the next, talked about the other exciting and the new verticals coming in. IoT you mentioned. And you specifically said that it's not just a mobile. Clearly, it is a very related to that. But could you just explain what are we doing and why specifically? What angle does GLF will bring into the whole discussion?
Right. So actually, IoT is an area which has been talked about quite regularly and aggressively through the GSMA and through other IoT representative forums. But because the value associated with it, particularly on the international wholesale settlement side, has not been clearly identified as a singular product set with individual identifiers for IoT devices, but instead IoT is a product from an international wholesale point of view that's sort of been looking for a productization home. If you want to go and settle for IoT services between UAE, Germany, Hong Kong, for example, you really have to piggyback legacy-style roaming arrangements for SIM cards or whatever the case may be. It adds layers of complication in terms of settlement and identifiers. And the GSMA has been doing some work in that space, but not a large amount of work associated with commercial settlement, but rather on technical specification. There are other industry forums that have been involved in pushing things forward, but even as recent as last week, I attended the special IoT forum that took place in front of GSMA last week in Barcelona. The discussion was about use cases, technical in nature, but no discussion amongst the service providers around the commercial interfaces. You even see now the vendors such as Ericsson, Nokia, and others who are eager to set up their own managed services network in order to facilitate that discussion and take over responsibility for that, because there isn't some sort of industry standard for the commercialization framework, for the settlement of complex IoT use cases. And so this is where the GLF has decided to have a look. Deutsche Telekom, which has a large interest today in IoT because of the many manufacturers in Germany that are of vehicles and of appliances and so on that are delivering all sorts of use cases around the world, they obviously have a vested interest, and they find their product team increasingly trying to piggyback manual resources in the roaming environment. They said, look, can we find some way, perhaps at the GLF level, to pursue a dialogue around establishing clearer identifiers for IoT devices, for example, and what then would be the commercial framework and the productization approach that would be done in some sort of sensible approach amongst the service provider community. And we highlighted that IoT might start with mobile, but actually an IoT device might sit in a specific location sitting on a fixed network. So what happens if you want an IoT device to terminate with a fixed network that doesn't have a roaming arrangement? What then do you do? If they don't have roaming arrangements, you're stuck. Once again, technology is out there, product development, thought process, creativity, but no legacy productization and contracting environment that fits the mold. So how can we perhaps work as an industry in order to do that? Now, it's interesting that you bring this up immediately after we spoke about distributed ledger technology, because we're looking at them, frankly, as separate areas at the moment. IoT and saying, okay, first, how do we agree the common points for IoT interaction, for data connectivity, for settlement of traffic, for multiple user access, and for security? Perhaps, though, if we create the automation of smart contracting through the distributed ledger technology, that can be a facilitator to the IoT. So one area of work in GLF may facilitate another area of work of GLF. But do we at GLF have the resources to do that? Maybe not. And so we're hopeful to work with other industry bodies who would be interested to pick up this workload and to say, okay, let's get the mandate from you, GLF, about what is the commercial driver, what is the direction that the industry needs to take. Let us tackle this with working group people, perhaps even using people from inside your own product houses or inside your own technology houses in order to facilitate, and then we'll bring it back to you, GLF, for an endorsement process. And that, I think, has been done successfully, and so we find that IoT is quite meaningful now, particularly as 5G is just about upon us.
Absolutely. So, again, a work which is just starting, but with the potential significant implications for the wider industry. I saw one of the question came in that what is the key achievement done by GLF and what was felt by the industry? And I think this is, if I may suggest, probably could be, in terms of work that is out there in public domain, is our work on fraud. Because it was actually on this stage a year ago, precisely a year ago, we launched the Code of Conduct Against Fraud in collaboration with the i3 Forum, who will be Christian Michaud, who actually also sits in the GLF, and also in i3 Forum, chairs the i3 Forum. He will be doing a presentation immediately after this as a combination in this presentation. But that was launched here a year ago with 8 participating signatories. Today we have 28 signatories to that. What would you say regarding the success of that? Is it just a piece of paper that people have signed for marketing purposes, or are we actually seeing anything?
First of all, there are a few carriers that already have raised their hand in the GLF that say that they've seen a demonstrable reduction in fraud on their network in terms of how they're able to measure it. And so the next step that the GLF is taking in anti-fraud is also to establish common KPIs for measurement and management of that activity. But the instinct already of key service providers in the GLF is that it is working. That's number one. Number two, if it was just GLF members who had signed up to the Code of Conduct of Anti-Fraud, then maybe one might be suspicious. But what we now see is that there are carriers who are not even members of the GLF who have voluntarily chosen to sign up to the Code of Conduct for Anti-Fraud and recognize how critical that is. I think that's already an indication. They're saying, look, we don't need to be part of the GLF right now, but we really like what you did in this space, and we want to sign up, we want to put our name there, and we want that endorsement, that seal of endorsement of the work that you did, together with the I3 Forum, should be facilitated and understood. So I think that's fantastic. And what's interesting is that we've given the working group a challenge. Also, we said, look, you've managed to start the process of hopefully ultimately eradicating fraud completely in voice and messaging networks. But once you do that, fraud's going to move on. Fraud's going to go to virtual machines. In the spin-up of VMs and instances and so on, we're seeing fraud in that space. How can this group that had been focused on legacy traffic take the concept of anti-fraud and move it to next-gen traffic? Because fraudsters will try and tackle one component of business, and then they'll move to the next and the next and the next, because that's the way they make their money. And it's important to make sure that companies that are investing capital, that are being regulated, that are looking at their activities properly, are also protecting against leakage that takes place, and certainly want to secure their networks in some way. And so I think I was excited to see that the working group was willing to move beyond voice and messaging to next-gen services.
Absolutely, and a number of others. So unfortunately, with best intentions, it is probably a fight that's never over, but obviously we will work to shut one door at the time. There's a question facing a challenge on machine-generated voice traffic. It is in the scope of GLF work.
It's in the scope, I think, of the subcommittee that's dealing with anti-fraud, and I think I sort of answered that activity. Machine-generated voice comes in different forms. Sometimes it's done as a result of the virtual machines that are spun up, and certainly that's within the scope of what the subcommittee is charged to do. The subcommittee really, quite frankly, is simply endorsing the very excellent work that's done by I3 Forum in this space. And I3 Forum, I think, is really the ones that deserve the recognition for the activity that's taking place in this area, and that's part of their scope as well, including also establishing KPIs that are commonly accepted by the industry.
Absolutely. Another area of similar collaboration, and you mentioned earlier, was MEF and around the LSO orchestration and the work we're doing around settlement. What are the focus specifically from a GLS perspective on settlement? What are the problems that we are trying to address in that area? And again, why are they critical to address at this point?
Well, I think, often the elephant in the room sometimes for carrier dialogue is the clouds, to be quite honest. What is Facebook doing? What's Google doing? What's Alibaba doing? What's Tencent doing? And we have this dialogue, which is an inter-carrier relationship, but what's happening with the clouds and how are they looking to provision, and to what extent are we also looking to work with them? And is it aspirational to work with the clouds? Do the clouds aspire to work with the carrier community, or do they just want to step over them? That's part of the challenge. MEF has done excellent work in carrier to carrier, and they have been challenged, I think, to move forward to the next model. First, they've formulated that MEF is not just about Ethernet, it's not just about physical infrastructure, but it's also about software provisioning. And now I speak about MEF, and I see Kevin in the room from MEF. So the provisioning that takes place today through the LSO, through the lifecycle orchestration approach, is also focused on the software environment. How does hardware and software meet each other in a standardized format, using APIs that have been ratified by MEF, that have been proposed by the carrier environment? To what extent, though, can that provisioning then outface into the cloud community? And that's going to be the next challenge. First, perhaps for forums such as MEF, but not just, others as well. And I think that we as a carrier community through the GLF have to be very careful not to bury our head in the sand. And we need to push entities such as MEF and others to say, okay, we're on the road to sorting through carrier to carrier. How do we do cloud to cloud and carrier to cloud? Because if the clouds have one possible problem, is that unlike the carrier community that's been functioning for the last 150 years, which has always held as a beacon the concept of interoperability. Imagine that even countries that have been at war with each other have still been willing to terminate telecom traffic one to another. at least through a third party. Universality of communications facilitates mankind. I know that sounds a little bit kitschy, perhaps a little naive, but that's quite critical. So if you take a company that is device-oriented, perhaps such as Apple, or another company that is focused on cloud, and they say, no, you can only function in our ecosystem. And we don't want to create a structured interoperability capability that's universal to all users. It's a bit of a miss in terms of what ICT is supposed to be providing to humankind, right? So if we can facilitate that interoperability, I think we're doing ourselves a favor, and we need to therefore reach out to the clouds to get them to embrace this concept. And they may demand of us that we be software enabled, so that we facilitate automation in the interaction and the relationship with them. And I think that what we're doing here in MEF around distributed ledger, where we may be going in IoT, where we may be going around edge cloud, and where LSO is for MEF, and where some of the ITU thought processes are, is leading us in that direction. So hopefully that's a positive message going forward, but there's a lot of work yet to do.
I think that's very eloquently and aspirationally end for the discussion. However, if there's any other questions, burning questions someone would like to ask from the audience, happy to take those. But if not, I'd like to thank you, Mark, very much for taking the time today, and I wish you a very good rest of the conference. And for the rest of you, I would like to introduce Christian Michaud to do a presentation on I3 Forum and the update, which is obviously linked very closely to our activities. But thank you, Mark.
Jussi, thank you, and thank you to the team at Capacity in the GLF office for all the hard work that you do. It's you're a bit of an unsung hero. And you deserve a lot of praise for the work that you do, and Roz Irving, who facilitated, deserves a lot of thanks for the work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Very kind. Thank you. Thank you.